Hello everyone and welcome to Freemium Mode, the stream where we give you all the tips, guidance and advice on how to excel when it comes to games marketing. This one's a really interesting one. I'm mixing up my intro this time with, usually I put plugs at the end, but my plug at the beginning is going to be about our amazing podcast, the Games PR podcast, and obviously it's because of the topic of this show, which will be all about podcasts, joined by the hosts of the Games PR podcast, as well as people who work diligently on our clients' comms, Jack and Tom. It's great to have you on, and I'm really looking forward to actually being the host this time rather than a guest on our show.
I'm
nice change of pace.
I'm used to being a host, so it's nice to give someone else a turn.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing whether you just suddenly take over halfway through and I have to kind of reel you back in. I'll have to give you a prompt at some point. But
it's like having to it's like giving the player one controller over to someone else when they come around to your house. That's how Jack feels today.
Yeah, Jack definitely has my second-hand knockoff Xbox controller that doesn't have the X on the on button. It's just a white light button. No, but thank you all for joining. As always, this is a show where we answer some common questions and queries people have around a given topic. This week is podcasts, and we will be using Jack and Tom's insight to give us all the know-how that you can do to make sure that your podcasts can excel. As always, if you have any questions, please pop them in the comments and we'll get to them if we have time. But hopefully this will be a really interesting conversation. We're going to be covering off everything from the kind of planning side of things all the way to running a show and, most importantly, evaluating and seeing what you can do to improve. So I think this is a really great topic, and I think podcasts have really taken off since COVID, and I think most companies are always trying to look into how they can do them. I know it's something that's a common conversation that we work with on our clients. As I said, we even have one. So this is, I think, a very relevant topic that we engage with. So to kick us off, Jack and Tom, I'd love to open up with the first question on our list of how do we identify the topical theme of our show? Obviously, there's quite a few games PR podcasts out there, or games PR podcast, but games podcasts out there. So if you are a games company wanting to start doing your own podcast, like how would be the best approach for identifying that topical theme and creating a show around it?
I know we like to put ourselves in the audience's seat and just consider, what do they want to know? What might they not know about? And it's then our job to give them that information in a digestible and hopefully entertaining way. So that's one way of doing it, is putting yourself in that seat. But Tom, I know you can also think about it the other way around, which is thinking about what you want them to know that they don't know.
Yeah, and I think, as obvious as that is, that comes from like what you've said, Jack, about what might people want to know, but also what can you share? Where are your areas of expertise? And in our case with the podcast that we do, being people who know about PR and marketing, our podcast, that's what it's all about. And it sounds like such an obvious point, but I think the best place you can start is, if you want to do a podcast, it's what are you interested in and what are you informed on? And from there, I think that really then goes on to inform everything else about a show and planning it and where you go from there.
You go with what you know.
Yeah, look at that. Coined a phrase. I think those are the audience and your own knowledge are the two places where you really start.
Where it can get tricky, though, is if you want to talk about a topic that might be current and trending, and then it depends, do you know enough about that topic to have a say? There have been times where we've been looking at topics for our Games PR podcast, and we go, that's something we feel we can talk enough about, we're informed upon. There might be others where we go, well, this is where we need someone else to come on to almost tell us about it as a guest. And I know we're going to jump onto guests later. So just one more point about when you're trying to identify what the topic or theme will be, if you do want to do something that's trending, that's current, you need to consider when the finished version of that is going to go out, because if it's going to take you a long time to produce this episode, there's a risk that that content is going to be out of date. There are some incredibly fast moving topics in the industry, more than ever. So there's a risk that you might be misinformed, or that people just aren't interested in that anymore and they've moved on to something else. It's almost like taking months to come up with a really deep dive into something like Pal World, and we're recording this in July, and that's kind of fallen off the radar of a trending conversation because so many more games have come on to replace it.
It's about, oh sorry Max, I was just going to say really quickly, it's about, I think to summarize that, it's about being evergreen and approaching, if you're looking to do something that's less focused on news and is more, focused on like how we do things, it's all about providing people with information and with ideas and with knowledge. I think every episode you do needs to be evergreen, and so that obviously things change over time and advice changes and trends change. But if you can have a podcast where over time your content is very evergreen and someone can listen to an episode 2 years down the line and it's still useful, I think that's quite a good example of a successful podcast. As I said, opposed to if you're looking something that's more focused on those like news and very like relevant things, then that's obviously less important. But I think being evergreen is really important and super useful.
I think it's a really interesting point. And so Jack and Tom, in that scenario, if you are like, oh, I really want to talk about a particular game launch or a media beat, would you say that the safe option is to find that broader topic that can be evergreen and use those as examples? So regardless of when that episode comes out, even if that news story is no longer on the radar for people, it's still like a nice reference point. Would you say that's the best approach?
I think so.
Go on.
Well, this is where we might have differing opinions.
We're both keen to share our thoughts. I'll let you start.
My thing here is, and it might be different to what people like with movies and things, but sequels aren't always bad in a way that you can cover off a topic. For example, we did an events one, and then if something like a big pandemic happens, that content might change. So you can revisit that topic. Just because you recorded a topic once doesn't mean you can't. That's it. You need to move on to something else. You can do follow-ups. You can do revisits. You can expand upon that topic in more detail. Perhaps you want to do a series of episodes on a topic. So that perhaps is something to consider rather than closing it off and being done with it after one topic episode.
It's a really good point. Really, really good point. So then going on from kind of like identifying your topic, whatever that is, I think most people will come to that slight hesitation about engaging with a podcast because depending on their size and capabilities, they're going to want to know how they can practically do it. And so often, I know you guys face this question quite a lot, is the hardware and software side of things. And I know that you've done a lot of work establishing what's useful and what's flexible for various different clients. So we'd love to hear your kind of guidance for people who are wanting to start a podcast but don't necessarily know what practically they need to do from a hardware and software point of view.
I think I'd say before we dive into the specifics, and I know we're going to, the example I always like to give with something like this is and hear me out, when YouTube first started, it was this site where anyone could grab a camera and sit down in front of it and talk about stuff, or you could get a really cheap capture card and record a game and talk about it. And it was, you look back now, like you look from today and you look back at those videos that are 10 or 15 years old and it's all really unrefined, but it's content that was successful at the time, and some of those people are still successful now. And I think the point from that is, with a podcast, it's the biggest thing that will stop you from starting it is that hesitation. I think just to dive in and get started. Nowadays, the tools that you need to do it are so freely available to make use of, and they're so simple and they're so intuitive that I think it's just a case of diving in, getting started. You'll make mistakes, But I know that now we're going to go on and outline some of our recommendations for equipment and software. But I just think that's a really important thing to say straight away, is that you don't need to have a multi-million-pound studio or $1,000 microphones and so on and so forth. It just takes a good idea, and then you sit down and get started and learn on the job. I guess is probably the best way to say it.
Yeah, it sounds obvious, and this is where I wanted to chuck a pun in. But a good microphone is, of course, important, but you don't have to break the bank. And with, as Tom's alluding to there, you don't have to have an in-person studio. You can have a virtual studio. So there are so many different free tools out there, all the way from sitting down and starting with recording. You can record using Discord. You don't need to sign up for Discord Nitro. You can just have a free Discord, get everyone in the channel, start recording from there. Or you can use Riverside. You're going to need programs for not just recording, but then the post-production. So your audio editing, your video editing. And there are lots of different software that's free, freemium, DaVinci Resolve, Canva, Capwing, all the way to your paid tools like Premiere Pro and Final Cut if you're using Mac. So there is some element of skill involved, which I think we'll come to later, but there's a wealth of tools out there. But going back to what you said, Tom, about how YouTube started, I think the current landscape we're in, it's easier than ever, for better or worse, for people to get their opinion out there and make content. We've seen people the term podcast could mean anything. Somebody could have a TikTok podcast, which is a very, very short form, minute or two, even less, just the same as an hour plus counts as a podcast. So when it comes to what software and hardware, it could just be your mobile phone and everything's on there.
And with that, actually, it's an interesting. You touched on editing software. Like, would you say that that's a key part of the process, even if you're just starting out? Even say you just wanted to go, right, when turn the mics on, just speak for 40 minutes and then upload and see how that does. Would you still hesitate on that and actually advise the editing process? Because obviously it takes time. It takes a bit of skilling up to know how to use it, even though a lot of these are intuitive. Is that something you should be looking at day one, or is it something we feel can wait until people get more comfortable with the approach of podcasts?
I always think it's a good idea with anything to, whatever you do, I think it's always good just to go back and have a look at it. The biggest thing for me, and I was one of those people who, when I was like 10 or 11, was out there making really bad Minecraft videos on YouTube. And I remember even then being like, oh, I hate the sound of my voice. That's probably the biggest thing you'll encounter. Like, I recommend editing stuff, but the biggest thing you'll have to deal with, and it sounds so silly, but honestly, it's the first big thing is probably going to be, I don't want to listen to myself back. But, joking aside, I think now it's what Jack was saying about anyone can make stuff, and that's great, but it also does make it harder to, we're here talking about how to make a successful podcast. It makes it harder to be successful. And I think that taking the time to sit down, and it doesn't have to be about cutting every 10 seconds and jumping between clips, but just going through and removing. There might be a minute or two at a certain point where you look back and you think, oh, that didn't really make much sense, and you can just remove that stuff. And I think on another note, in regards to editing, I think that video editing in particular, but audio as well, can seem quite scary. If you load up a program like DaVinci, which in my opinion is simpler than quite a lot of editing programs, but when you open it up for the first time, it's daunting. You've got all these different tabs and all these different options, and I think it can be very easy to just go, no, I can't do this. But there are so many resources online where if you just start using a video editor or an audio editor and you're having a problem, just put the name of the program in and Google your problem, and no doubt someone on YouTube or Reddit or some social platform has figured out a solution, and there'll be 50 comments of people telling you how to fix it. So I think that it's like the whole thing of getting into podcasting. You can hesitate, but we're lucky nowadays that there are so many resources that, again, I think the best thing you can do is just dive in and get started. And a lot of these programs are super intuitive. It's just a case of learning how to use them and getting comfortable. And then, you might get 5 episodes in and think, oh, I want to start adding some, fancy effects now. And you can learn how to do that. You don't have to be doing everything on day one. But it's good to get started on day one.
Definitely. So going back to something that Jack touched on at the beginning of this chat was also about guests, and this is something that I know that we work with quite a few clients who they kind of are regularly getting guests into their shows. I know you do it on our podcast as well, but I think that can be quite nerve-wracking to feel that however often your podcast is going out every month or something, you're having to think to yourself, right, I need to get someone new in to speak about something. So, if you don't feel like you've got a good runway of potential guests lined up, like, should that stop you from doing a podcast? I think I can guess the answer to this, but it would be great to also get your broader thoughts about guests in general on podcasts, and how that can be approached the best way.
There's a risk with guests that having them too frequently, if you have a recurring cast, yourself as a host, potentially a co-host or two, and if that's the 3-person booth per episode and then guests, there's a risk that if you bring too many guests on, that cast gets kind of pushed to the side, and when you do come to the point where you can't get a guest that week, then your audience is super thrown because they are always used to having a guest, and that might halt your entire plans. So for sure, get guests on where possible, but it's not the be all and end all if you can't get a guest. And sometimes it's better not to have a guest. Again, it depends on the topic, depends on the resources you have available. But yeah, the takeaway from that is don't let not being able to get a guest stop you from recording.
I think I totally agree with what Jack said. I think the only caveat is obviously if inherently by the design of your podcast it requires guests.
Yes.
But that's obvious. But I know there's podcasts that I listen to that work on the fact that every episode is with someone different because they're the focus of the episode. But in that case, the question is kind of answered for yourself. But with the podcast that we do, we tend to have a guest on every other podcast, and that, to go back to what we first started talking about, we use that as a way to fill gaps in our knowledge or areas where we're not quite as strong, and then it provides an interesting opportunity to give an audience something different than usual and do it in a really informed way. But yeah, I think that I would never say, you don't need to have a guest on every single episode. It's a case of making sure that the people who you do get are relevant and also interesting to the audience, and you can look at them and think they've got a lot to offer and they're going to be able to help people learn something or be informed or just be entertaining.
You can fill that virtual seat if a guest isn't there or available by turning to user-generated content. Tom, you mentioned in the last segment about going online and finding answers for things by other people's experiences, which you can absolutely do in order to source questions or answers. Again, this goes back to the start, where thinking about what you want to know or vice versa, what you want to tell your audience. Consider if you are a game developer looking to put this podcast out, do you have an existing community that you can talk to and leverage as part of this? If this is more about trying to attract business, could you source comments from your network, or even just search a topic on LinkedIn? It goes back to our trending topic. If something is trending, consider what you might have seen on LinkedIn and be able to pull some screenshots. It's really no different to seeing news articles that talk about people's reactions to things and will then have example tweets or X's. I'm not really sure what the term is as, again, current. If you recorded a topic all about Twitter and then the name's changed, that's something to go back to. So absolutely, you can use that content as a way of building a show if you can't get a guest, but you still want to get that insight from another voice or voices in this case.
And I think something else you can do, and it's again, it's like editing your way around a problem, is if you've got someone who, you know, is able to provide insight, but you're not able to line up your schedules, there's nothing stopping you from still having that input. And it won't be live in the sense that it's recorded with them in the room or virtual room with you. But there's nothing stopping you from asking someone a load of questions, getting their answers, and then adding them into a podcast to create a kind of Wizard of Oz hidden behind the curtain situation where, you know, things appear that it is that live back and forth, and that's it's obviously a bit more tricky to do that, but that's another option. I think that it's wonderful that with having like a digital podcast, we can engage and interview people from all around the world, but that creates its own problems scheduling wise, and that's quite an effective way around that.
It's a really interesting point. I know that when we did a podcast when I first started here, like my internet cut out, but I was still recording, so you were able to splice that into the final footage, which was very artfully done, I have to say. I was very impressed with it.
Thank you.
I think that kind of comes, I know we've spoken about the frequency side of things in terms of like, you know, thinking about how long it takes to actually produce a podcast episode, but in terms of, is there any magic number on how often you should be putting out a new episode, or is it a flexible thing that just depends on your capabilities?
It's flexible. I think you need to consider how frequently you can actually do your show. If you commit to an episode every week and you find out that's too much, you're going to have to scale that back. Typically, a month is a good schedule. That's the plan we have in place, is trying to get an episode done each month. But all kinds of podcasts you might see on the socials, it says, sorry, no episode this week, with a reason. Maybe they've gone to an event or something's come up, and then they try and set expectations of when the next episode will launch. So don't overcommit and get too bold in the plan to do something every week if it's just not going to be something that you can actually do, because we've talked about the production side, we've talked about the guest sourcing. So again, think about what your show is. If it is a almost hangout style, you go live on Twitch or TikTok, that style thing, perhaps even a LinkedIn style thing like this, then perhaps you can do something every week. Just think about what you need to do to make your show the best it can be and what you want out of it, and then think about how realistic your schedule is going to be with all that in mind. Lots of things.
I think quite an effective way to plan stuff in general, and especially something like a podcast, because I think people sometimes forget that it's not just the hour that you record. There's so much extra stuff before and after that can affect a schedule. I always think the best way to look at it is, say, you know, if you're planning ahead of time, what's the worst possible case? Like, if I have no time or if I'm really busy, how often would I be able to make sure that I can get a good, high quality episode out there? Because it's easy to look at when, oh, well, I've got loads of time at the moment, I could do one every day. But in 6 months' time, you know, say, as we've said before, if you're a developer and suddenly things are ramping up and you're thinking, oh, it's like something around your neck and you can't get round to it, and then you're cursing yourself because you were very confidently saying, oh, we can do one a week, and then it gets to a point and that's just not possible anymore. But I think it largely depends on like the type of podcast that you actually do. There's podcasts that I listen to that are daily, but that's that's news. That's news focused, so it makes sense that it's daily. There's podcasts that are every 2 weeks, and that's on less relevant stuff. But because it's still bi-weekly, there is some like relevancy in terms of what they discuss. But I think it very largely depends on what you're actually making content about. But this is coming from someone who will watch like 8-year-old video essays on YouTube. So you know, what do I know about relevancy and
people? Yeah, totally. We've got actually a comment coming from John talking about how many downloads or listeners we think a podcast needs to be seen as successful and worthwhile. I suppose it's a tricky one, especially when companies are first starting out doing a podcast. It takes some time to gain traction, but would great to get some of your thoughts on like that type of thing. I know we might go into some of the reviewing points later on in this chat, but in terms of this direct question, would be great to get your thoughts on it.
I think to use the example, perhaps you consider this podcast you're producing like a TED Talk almost. So if you were to have a room full of 150 people, for example, that room is going to seem pretty full. When you look at that on a screen, maybe you think 150 is pretty low, because your mind might compare that to what you'd expect from a YouTube video or some other kind of stream. So it really, I think, goes back to who you're aiming at, because there's a very high chance, if you are making a very targeted niche podcast, that 100 people in your niche is a lot, because there just aren't enough out there. Say you are wanting to talk purely about art within games, and you want to talk to designers and artists. That's a much smaller pool of people you're targeting than a very broad podcast all about marketing, where you can reach lots and lots of different sectors. So that brings me back to that room analogy. A room of 150 graphic designers and artists is going to be a lot compared to a room of thousands of people, of which most of them possibly aren't even in that niche. But so that's just something to think about, is how many people do you think are out there, which you might know of when you're considering, do I need to make a podcast first and foremost?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really interesting point and a good analogy to make about that room scenario, and about making sure you're targeting the right people. It goes back to the topic we were saying right at the start, in terms of identifying what your podcast is going to be about, and that might narrow the audience pool down. But if it's a really valuable and targeted thing, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Before we move on, John also asked quite a fun question, which I also wanted to add into this chat here, which was, what are some of your favorite games podcasts, and what do they do well? I'm sure one of them will be the Games PR podcast, and that's not a biased statement at all. But would love to know kind of what some of the good games podcasts out there do well.
Or if Alex was on with us, he would definitely be hyping up. He was a big Giant Bombcast fan, and that was actually, I mean, that's been going over 15 years. We talk about podcasts feeling like a fairly new thing, but that's one of the longest running, and I think has had quite an effect on podcasting within the game space. So I think from that, there's the Nextlander podcast, which fills that role of those within the games media sharing their knowledge with people outside the space and within the space, and giving a balance of what they're up to, what is in the industry, and being able to share that with listeners from within and outside the space. So that's two examples that spring to mind. And the other one I want to mention, which we might dig into a bit later, because I would consider it a podcast because it fills certain things we've talked about, was during the ramp up of Cyberpunk towards release all those years ago. It was very weird saying that now. It still feels fairly recent. They would have those episodes where they would be telling the audience, this is what's coming up, this is what's going to be in the game. They were very well produced. They had hosts and all the branding, the iconic yellow branding. And that filled very much the service of, we're telling people something. It's what our audience want to know. It's what we want to tell, in a format that is more digestible and exciting than patch notes and devlogs of written content. So just some examples I've chucked out there. I'll let Tom have his 2 cents.
How long do we have?
Not long enough.
No, I think I can name a couple, and I think they all have different advantages. I think that probably one of the best ones is My Perfect Console, which I think probably a lot of people are familiar with. Incredibly well produced, and I think that's a great example of a podcast that doesn't bend to, I think, this more modern will of everything has to be SEO focused and trend focused, and it has to be about this, and this, and that's just something where, you know, people come on, they have a conversation for an hour, and they're always interesting. And I think the reason why that's so successful is because inherently the idea of that podcast is interesting to people. Everyone who plays video games, when they talk to people who like games as well, ask them what their favorites are. And so it's that, but in a podcast. And I think the guests are always interesting. So I think, you know, it's a good idea, a good throwback to what speaking about guests, and how having really good guests can be so effective. But then I think Indie Venture's quite a good one as well. And that's very much, as you can tell by the name, focused on indie games, and that's bi-weekly, and that again is very personality driven. And I think that's quite a big thing for me, is that when people have so many options for how they can digest content, in quote marks, because I don't like content as a word, you know, having a good personality can be really important. And if you're not offering trends and information that's up to date, often what really carries the success then is having, you know, as Jack was saying before, in terms of like how many downloads you get, you can have a smaller niche, and if you've got a really strong personality within that, you can like carry that community, and that can lead to good success. So I'll stop there. I was just looking on my Spotify, and I was like, my God, I have so many video game podcasts. So I'll stop there. Apologize to the 50 that didn't make the cut. But
I think what's interesting with both of you, thank you, John, for the really great questions. But I think what's really interesting with the both of you talk about how well produced these shows are, and I think that seems to be quite a common thread so far in this conversation. Is it's very easy for people just to hit record and just chat for an hour and then throw it up, but it's the stuff that goes behind it that is where it turns from being a podcast to a successful podcast, I guess. And I think it ties nicely to our next question, in terms of how do you structure a show. I think it's probably quite challenging, because on the one hand, you want it to be, you know, if you want it to be a free form discussion, that's great, but you need to still, you know, direct it. And I know that even just doing this stream, which is a lot free form and can be flexible in all way, shape and form, it's still something that you need to find that right balance. So how would you advise on the best way to structure a podcast episode? Say you've got that blank sheet of paper, you've got the date in the diary, you got your guest, if you are going to have a guest, how's it going to
go? You'd want to draw up the topics and themes you want to talk about, you want to cover, and then perhaps once you have a few ideas on paper, you can move them around into some semblance of a structure. I wouldn't suggest scripting it word for word, especially if you've got a guest. You can't be giving them a script to read off word by word, because that's where it then just doesn't feel organic, and that touches upon the running length, because if you have an hour plus scripted, it's just not going to feel as engaging as an organic conversation, because you're not leaving any room for natural discussions like we've had even here with some points about caveats and sidetracks. So draw up an order, then you can refer to that as you go, but I wouldn't suggest me making it we have to follow this order word for word and scripting it as such.
I feel like, I mean, first of all, please plan it out. Like Jack's, it sounds so obvious, but I think that even if you listen to a podcast and you think it sounds like super off the cuff and everything's very freeform, I can guarantee you everyone in that room is either working with like a Google Doc or they've got like something open in front of them which has got every single thing that they're going to hit. I don't think there's very few podcasts where I think they're just going off the dome for like 2 hours, because that would be chaos. But I think how I like to approach a plan is that I think it's nice to have a bit of freedom within it. I think I'd say like 70% plan, 30% ad lib. Because I think it's really important to be authentic. And I think that comes through, you might have a point on a discussion sheet or like a plan to, we'll address this. And then you start addressing this. And then if someone else goes, this has just made me think of something else, you shouldn't be like, no, we have to stick to the script. Yeah, please move on. Because often those really cool interactions and what can be the best part of an episode come when someone goes, I didn't even think of that before we started writing an episode. I also think it's really important to, if you have a guest, make sure they have the opportunity to either, it doesn't have to be feeding directly to what you're working from, but make sure that ahead of time they have a really good idea of what you're going to address. And even if you go to them and say, we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on X, Y, and Z, because it can make it more comfortable for them. It can make it less, stressful. You don't want someone coming into a podcast environment and they're completely unaware of what they're about to be peppered by. But that just comes back to planning and making sure that you can go into an episode confident that if there is maybe like a lull in the conversation, you can kind of, give your document a little look and think, let's talk about this then. So you're always prepared for what comes next.
It's really interesting you say about how organic it is. I just think about the old school but Ricky Gervais show, and actually how many edits and cuts are in between their really funny conversations, and you do wonder how much time they probably spent on a single episode to condense it down to like half an hour of just the pure golden funny bits. And I'm sure it's the same with any podcast that seems super ad lib as well, all the extra time that goes into the background of it. When you are,
I imagine it's sorry, I was going to say it made me think. I imagine that I think of, like when you see the behind the scenes of like a Marvel film or a Star Wars film and you think, I bet it was so fun to work on that. And then you look at all the behind the scenes and it looks so boring because everything's just like blue screens and like getting cut every 2 seconds. Like a really funny podcast can be a bit like that. Not that it's boring, but it's more that there's often a lot of stuff that will be like removed, or there'll be like awkward pauses that are cut out. But yeah, sorry, that just made me think of that, and I've got that image in my head.
You were probably watching the same thing I was about Ewan McGregor speaking about he wouldn't do it again if he was asked, because of just how he was just speaking to a tennis ball the entire time of episode 2 and
That's
3.
how Jack feels when I'm on an episode. He's like, just talking to a tennis ball.
Speaking of behind the scenes thing, I was keen to also know, in terms of the structure of it, what about the other elements around it, beyond recording and editing, beyond structuring the show, what else do people need to be thinking going into it? Because I think it's very clear it's not just you hit record. Even if it's not just you hit record and edit it, there's other steps beyond that. So what are those things, and what do they look like?
Well, you'll need your guest's permission if you have one. That was a great point we chatted to this morning, but before the show actually, was if you're going to have a guest on, you got to make sure that they're happy. As Tom alluded to, they understand what they're going to be talking about and they know what they're getting into. So I think that's a really important thing, is just to make sure everyone's quite literally on the same page and is going to be happy. So when you are in post and editing, unless you have said we're doing this straight live and it goes out, give them a chance to hear it before it goes out if they want to make any edits or comments as well. Mm-hmm. It's important to cover that off with them.
And then I think on the wider stuff, I think Max, you're asking about as well, just so you have a podcast, you have an episode. So you got episode 1, it's ready to go. You need to consider name, branding. Branding can be a case of, are you going to have a logo? Are you going to do something? You need something for platforms like Spotify, where you have like the small thumbnail of the image of a podcast. And even branding can come down to stuff like colors. Which colors do you want people to associate with your podcast? And that's something where, an obvious example, if you're doing something about Nintendo, probably do it in red, because that's a color that's associated with Nintendo. But just as a really obvious example, but then that opportunity to brand something, I think, is really exciting, and it's worth taking the time to really sit down and figure out what that looks like. But at the same time, you might get, it's, as we've spoken about before, it's an evolution. You might get 5 or 6 episodes in and think, oh, I don't really like the name, or I don't really like the logo, and feel free to change it. We see giant companies changing their logos and the names and so on and so forth all the time. Don't be afraid to do that. I think another thing to consider is social presence. You don't need to be on every platform, but you want to make sure that you're active on the ones that you are. I wouldn't recommend launching a page on every single, Mastodon, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, Facebook, because it comes back to when we're talking about scheduling, how much time do you have? So you want to make sure that you're consistent across the ones that you do have, and I think that's quite an obvious thing. But
where is your audience? If you're again, you're making a business focused one, absolutely you want to promote it on LinkedIn. Promoting it on Instagram probably isn't part of that plan. Whereas it might be the inverse. If you have a very consumer focused one, you're going to be wanting to post it on X, perhaps cut it down onto YouTube and TikTok, whereas LinkedIn might be a lower priority for you. So yeah, agree with you there, Tom. Think about the platforms first before you jump onto everything, which I think we've covered before on these the social media many times, all different topics and resources we've put out there. That's a common one, is don't overcommit to social if you can't keep up.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure Tamsin's very happy to hear that as well as a bit of advice.
Tamsin's just like, yes, well done. I think probably the final thing, and I think we've addressed it quite consistently across all these different areas, but just to kind of reinforce it, I think you need to really, I think something you need to know from day one is the tone of the entire thing. Not just the episodes, but also the branding, that social voice that you have. Are you looking to be more casual and laid back and relaxed? And if you are, that means that everything you do has to be in that way. Whereas if you're looking for something, like Jack said, if it's more business focused and you are quite keen to be it doesn't have to be consistently super serious, but if you're leaning more into that, then that's something that has to inform everything else that you do. Because I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is, going back and forth between, several different kind of tones, because then you end up in a situation where maybe half your audience are there for one reason and the other half are there for another. And you'll end up perhaps losing both, because people like that consistency from something like a podcast.
It's an extension of your brand. You are on there representing yourself at bare minimum as a speaker on there. But if it is part of the company or it's a solo thing, again, consider that, because whatever you're saying could technically be seen as the company's official line on something. So just consider that when you are thinking about what you're doing this for and how you're going about doing it.
That just made me think of on one of our last episodes of our Games PR podcast, where us three had a conversation about which video game animal we'd be able to take down in a fight. But I think to that point, that's the kind of that's our tone. Not that we solely ask those questions, but with what we do, it is more laid back, and then that informs the people we bring on and the way that we approach topics. And then I think that's quite a consistent voice that we have, is that we inform, but we do it in a way that is laid back. Again, in the last episode where we spoke about digital events, we spoke about the cost of the Summer Games showcases, and we calculated that in Taylor Swift's net fortune. But those are the kind of things where I think that's our tone, and we stick to that, and it's not unexpected to encounter those conversations. We don't go from being super serious to all of a sudden, talking about something really random.
No, I like that. I think because people know what know what they're going to get in for each episode. I guess that's the point, isn't it? And in the other stuff you spoke about very much covers off like how another point that we're going to go into is about the impact on the marketing strategy and combining it with social, combining it with other things, which I think is really, really true as well. I suppose one big question, which John's comment earlier definitely touched on, but I'd be good to kind of cover off anything else within this, is very much around the monitoring the effectiveness of the show, especially I'm sure when dealing with, we've had this where people might want to have the show really casual, but as a corporate entity they can be quite nervous about being so casual on a platform, and so justifying that it's working, it's doing well, it's engaging with the right people or whatever is a huge thing for anyone wanting to show that a podcast is an effective marketing tool. So what would you say in terms of that? Like, how was the best way to look at the effectiveness of your show, and what can you be monitoring?
There are so many analytics now, especially if you choose to publish your podcast through a tool like Buzzsprout. You get all kinds of data on the audience, what platforms they're listening on, where they are, which can help inform your content further. Perhaps, again, if you are seeing an uptick in people listening from their mobile or coming through one of the social media platforms you've been promoting it, because you've added UTM links in the description, that helps build a profile of who is listening, how they're listening. And that means you can either keep doing what you're doing or perhaps change it because you're seeing something unexpected. If you have an increase in viewers from another part of the world, perhaps you want to bring on a guest from that part of the world if it's a certain market you're looking to hit. So again, just start with the raw numbers and go from there.
Awesome. Brilliant.
Yeah, I was just going to say, about Buzzsprout. It's Buzzsprout. We really like Buzzsprout because it's a way that we can get things into loads of different directories, but it also has a lot of really useful information. And it's got tools where you can track all-time downloads, but you can also see how every episode does over a fixed period. So you can look at something like the first 7 days, and I think that gives you that. If you're doing something perhaps that's more focused in, if you've got like a news focused thing that goes out every week, something like seeing the first 7 days of download for each episode can be really quite a useful way to get an idea of how different topics are doing. And, if you're doing a good job, maybe certain areas are more interesting than others. So, numbers are, maybe some people think numbers are a bit boring, but they can be really useful. And that's probably one of the best tools to, outside of, I think it's worth, you don't necessarily have to measure your downloads against other people. It's more about looking at how your episodes compare to each other. And that's the best way that you can keep improving, because you can see perhaps what does work, what doesn't work. As Jack said, is there particular regions where some episodes do better than others? Does that mean that you have to look more into those areas because there's more opportunities there? I think the worst thing you can do is, really quick. I was just going to say the worst thing you can do is not use that data, because then you can't know how to improve.
Yeah. On a very micro level, if and again, perhaps a business side, if someone emails you and gets in touch and says, "Oh, I listened to this, wanted to get in touch," then that's a clear, obvious, someone listened, someone enjoyed the content and reached out because of it. So again, just check your inbox. If you've made it clear you want people to get in touch for a certain reason or in a certain way, if they then do, there's a strong chance it's because of the pod. And or perhaps you've invited a guest on, and as Tom says, with the numbers, if you see perhaps a spike because of that guest compared to other episodes, perhaps you might want to bring that guest on again if you think they are the one bringing that additional traffic. Much like we see games in general do collaborations all the time with different events and try and hit those different audiences or just push that brand with the help of something else. It's very common. Perhaps if that guest also has a podcast, you might go on their podcast and they go on yours, and it's a shared, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine type thing.
That's a really good point. Yeah, 100%. And I think it ties to that whole thing of very similar. If you haven't listened to it, it's on our YouTube, the LinkedIn episode that we had Tams in. I think that analysis side of things, it seems very much aligned with podcasts as it is with social media. So I think some great insight that can be shared across and help on both sides of things here. We're nearly at the end of our time, so I'm going to go with one more question, which is, ultimately, what are some of the common mistakes people make when producing a podcast? I think we talk about all the good stuff that can come from it, and we talked about it briefly about some big podcasts, and everyone can make one, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot that make very silly mistakes. What are the ones that you can easily avoid?
The audio levels. Make sure the audio levels are balanced, and where you can, minimize that background noise.
Yeah, and I think I was going to say the audio levels is like the immediate thing, but that's just like, I think you can even, not that you want either, but 100 times out of 100, I'd rather deal with a bit of background noise than inconsistent audio. And it's such an easy thing to solve because every audio editing tool has the ability to like limit and normalize audio. The first thing that will make someone stop listening to a podcast is if they're trying to relax and every 2 minutes they're there turning the volume up and down on the phone because one person speaks and it's really quiet and they have to turn it up, and then someone else comes in and it's like a foghorn coming through the headphones. So I think it's an audio focused thing. So audio is the biggest one. But I think
dumb is that something? Sorry, just being really dumb. Is that something that if you have a platform that's doing the recording, it's inbuilt within there, or is it something that each individual needs to deal with as they go in? It's just for anyone, myself included, any of the people listening that might not know the intricacies of it as well. Like how's it built into the process of recording?
Most platforms now have clear ways to see how if your audio is peaking. Some are a bit better because they're able to actually help do that like automatically and help adjust. But it's as simple as not to account for everyone's like computer, but most laptops and computers and so on and so forth, if you have a microphone, you can plug it in and you can go in the settings and you can see how the audio levels are. And that can be a case like with my microphone, it's on an arm, so I can pull it further back or closer, and you can adjust it that way. And it's just about taking that time before you even edit, just to go, okay, I don't want to be too loud, I don't want to be too quiet.
It's best to try and join it up. If somebody like Tom just did there, moving the mic, if somebody's moving about, that really throws things for a loop. So improve things, try and sit still where you can. It can be difficult for people, or we've seen it before where you might be wanting to record on location at an event, and you're working with what you've got, tripods and hand mics and things like that. So try and do what you can in the moment. Don't rely on the tools. Check it manually afterwards, and you should be able to fix things. Try and balance it to one person and make sure they all match. Because sure, software might say it's all good, but there's always the risk that upon recording and you listen to it back, something goes wrong. So check it afterwards, just to be safe.
I think another non-technical mistake as well, something that is a lot easier to deal with, is just making sure that I'd say don't just record an episode for the sake of it. You know, and I think the plan is what helps with that, because I think you'd struggle to write out a plan for an episode where there's nothing to say. So I think that's that first step in preventing you from kind of just sitting and talking about nothing for 35, 40 minutes. But B, if you are doing an episode, if you're recording an episode, it doesn't have to be longer than it needs to be. If it's shorter than it might normally be, say normally most of your episodes are an hour, and then you do an episode and it comes in at 45 minutes, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think sometimes there can be a tendency to be like, well, we need to keep going because it needs to be a certain amount of time.
Yeah, don't pad out that word count for the sake of it.
Yeah, you don't. The same as you don't want someone constantly going up and down on the volume. You don't want someone. I mean, the worst thing in the world is having a podcast or a video where someone keeps looking at the timer and they're thinking, how long is this going on for? Because nothing's actually happening.
So it's like an anime show that just takes 3 episodes to get to one point.
Yeah,
exactly.
Which brings me on to something I wanted to jump in before we wrap up here, is that once you have your podcast and you've finished, make a transcript out of it, because there's a chance you can use that within your social posts to have actual quotes of what's been said, rather than trying to remember or listen back and type it out as you go. And again, going back to perhaps the business, you're trying to use this as part of your marketing, you can use that transcript to create blog content, perhaps. You use the spoken word, transform it into written, and that's another angle, another lot of material you can use to push out somewhere. That's
really good tip. And actually, before we wrap up, conscious of time, I want to just end this like I usually do on just, you know, if anyone's just joined the last minute or they're only scrolling through this when it's up on YouTube, what's the one key takeaway that you would give? Just one quick bit of advice on them trying to make a successful podcast. What would be the thing that you would say to them, Tom?
That's a really good question. And you said you were going to ask this before, so I should have actually really thought about this. But now I'm thinking about it live, so you can watch my cogs turn. I think I'd honestly say just make sure you have a passion for doing it. Because ultimately, if you get some way in and then you decide you don't want to do it anymore, that's fine, and there's nothing stopping you. But I think just making sure that when you started, it's something that you care about and that you're invested in. Because otherwise people won't engage with it, because I think it's quite apparent when someone's doing something and they don't really want to do it. I think just having that care for it, whatever the topic is, and having that desire to share it with people is the one thing I'd say is, yeah, I think that would be my one bit of advice.
I like it. What about you, Jack?
Have a goal, have a plan, stick to it, but don't stick to it if it's not working. You know, have confidence in yourself and the plan you've made. But if you are seeing it's not working, adapt. There's nothing worse than you've said, I'm going to do a weekly 2-hour show, and you start disliking it and no one's listening. Don't stick to that. Improvise, adapt, overcome, as a wise man, I believe, once said.
Yes, exactly.
Sounds like you've gone like full Bear Grylls there.
That's brilliant. And yes, I think, who knows, maybe Freemium Mode is going to have to get to that stage at some point, but at the moment I think we're all enjoying it. Who knows? But no, thank you both for being on, and thank you to everyone who has been listening, the comments, and for the follows and all that lovely stuff. We really do appreciate it. It means an awful lot. A few more seconds of me just speaking, essentially going, you know what, we've got a bunch of stuff that you might want to listen to us about. We're on X, we're on LinkedIn, as you'll probably see from being on this. Make sure to follow, make sure to engage with our stuff. We produce 2 newsletters a month. One is a weekly newsletter that we do about games industry news from that week, and one is a monthly newsletter that is a roundup of some of the changing trends within the industry. It's a very new one, something that I think is really useful for everyone. It goes without saying, but I'll say it again, these guys have an amazing podcast. You should go and listen to it. It's awesome. They have some great guests on, but they also just have some great insight with them just 2 speaking, so definitely do that. And also, as always, we have a bunch of other resources on our site, so do drop us a link. If you're interested in speaking on this, if you want to talk about something, if you want us to talk about something, do drop us a message and we'll take it in for consideration. We're always keen to be answering the questions that the games community wants to know when it comes to marketing. But for now, thank you everyone who's followed and listened to us. Thank you, Jack, Tom, for taking the time out of your very, very, very busy week to speak to me about podcasts. And until next time, thank you so much. This has been Freemium Mode.